Oh, hello, Primals. I'd like today to share some of my thoughts on the Primal community and different modes of eating that I've been testing for the past many years. So, in case you don't know, my name is Dr. Diego Caleiro. I'm a doctor in biological anthropology. I'm also a philosopher, so I'm a scientist and a philosopher. And I've been eating a mostly carnivore diet for about 2 years now. And switched a couple of days ago to trying basically a pure raw diet. Seeing one of the many edits about raw primal that people are putting out these days. The epitomes are multiplying. I don't know if you guys saw that, but yeah. So here's what I learned in these 2 years of examination and participation in that particular movement. First of all, as an evolutionary anthropologist, I was very curious to see what our ancestors used to eat, which wasn't the domain of my PhD. I studied altruism, but it's still a very interesting question. And there seems to be pretty good evidence up to 3.3 million years ago that humans have been somewhat hypercarnivore. In fact, we coexisted with another species of hominin up to that point, and it seems to be that we were occupying different ecological niches. They were more plant-oriented and plant-based, basically. Like they have a sagittal crest that's pretty strong, kind of for chewing in the same way that gorillas do. And we occupy different niches. We were hypercarnivore. Our stomach acidity is that of a hypercarnivore. And I do think that, like, basically this movement is sort of taking over. The carnivores are definitely taking over. The vegans are definitely being taken down. And the raw carnivores are kind of growing, but it requires a very, like a very high level of open-mindedness or a very unusual level of, like, bad health to try raw carnivory. So what ends up happening is that almost everyone who's in raw carnivore is like 25 and under. Like I'm 39. I'm definitely the odd one out in that particular game, but I'm extremely high in openness and in mental flexibility and agility and all that. So do I think it's going to become sufficient? Like, I think it's going to become at least prevalent enough that people won't know each other's names anymore. Like, I can still locate, I don't know, 20, 30 different people in the community. I met many of them. We talked on TikTok back before I was banned on TikTok. And it seems to me like the movement might have an interesting future in that way. I really enjoy the videos by some of the people that have been posting lately, a bunch of interviews and community posts. And overall, within the health space, I think I trust the most Sverige. I would say that like there's tiers of people who have levels of competency in terms of how able they are to decipher what's going on in science and philosophy, which, I've studied for 15 years in academia. And Sverige has very good intuition. He's obviously not an academic, so he can't really like go into the minute details of things, but he has a relatively good intuition on telling like, oh, this paper ought to be dismissed because it has these and these features, and these features indicate that like you can probably kind of ignore that. On the carnivore side, I mean, I think Anthony Chafe is probably doing like the best work in terms of disseminating the ideas of carnivory. And I would say that the most competent person in terms of general knowledge and academic capability, like the person who's best able to read and process studies and so on, is Nick Norwitz, who's actually not a full carnivore. He eats like very heavy meat based, but he eats some like macadamia nuts or something. And Ben Bickman's pretty good. And what's the name of the other professor? Bart Kay. So Bart Kay and Nick Norwitz, in my opinion, are like highest in level of knowledge. Anthony Chafe is highest in level of like memeability and capability of like informing everyone around. And then on the raw primal side, I would say that like Sverige is in some sense on the top, not because he knows more than, I don't know, Face IQ, for example, or many of the other people arguing excellent health, many resident raw, many of the people arguing for eating raw meat, but because of this particular level of intuition that he seems to be able to distinguish things. And, he looked like not many people looked into the vitamin A literature more in depth and realize like to what extent it is valid or not valid. or copper literature to determine whether, to ascertain whether you should or not eat organs and so on. So that's basically like my frame is going to be based on like these people because I think they are the most competent in each subdomain, so to speak. And of course, there's a lot of like minor things where you can disagree with members of either community. I think one of the most famous sayings that Zverev has, that's my fox here. I think one of the most famous sayings that Zverev has is that how can you get more nutrients from something that you've destroyed the nutrients of? And, you know, as I explained to Enzo Health on TikTok, and I'll explain again here, like that actually does make sense for multiple reasons, right? Like cooking some parts that are extremely tough that you wouldn't be able to chew otherwise, the tendons, the whatever, even the bone, right? Like you're eating some sort of bone broth, you're going to be able to extract a lot more nutrients overall. You don't have to cook all the parts, you know, but you can still cook some fraction of an animal, and that's going to allow you to eat something that's a little bit closer to nose to tail. Another concern I see a lot that I don't particularly think is super relevant is worrying about avidin in eggs. If you're eating a carnivore diet, you're still going to be getting enough biotin from like the amount of meat that you're eating on a daily basis just to sustain your body, and there's no particular reason to worry about the whites and eggs unless you specifically have some sort of reaction or rejection of those things. One thing I just started experimenting with that I've only seen Anfu and Oscar Vor talking about in the community is washing your hair with eggs. I use duck eggs because basically I do a very fancy carnivore diet with basically mostly exotic animals. Like, you know, you see an ostrich egg here, and that's a goose egg, I think. Yeah, so my diet is definitely on the varied side. Another thing that I think it's a little tricky because it's so addictive and so delicious and can be so healing if you happen to hurt your body is that there's a lot of people recommending for people to drink a lot of raw milk. And I can tell from personal experience that raw milk, when you're older, right, like when you're older than 30, I'm 39, it prevents you from losing weight, which is one of the things that, you know, I would like to gain from this diet. So raw milk is complicated, you know, because it is designed to like maximize the size of a small calf into a cow in a couple of years. And that's basically going to mean, you know, growing this way if you're under 27 or something, but growing this way if you've passed that threshold. So, you know, it is with a very heavy heart that I have decided to, after 2 years, like doing raw milk quite frequently and also raw honey, to kind of go astray from that and get into zero carb carnivore. Also, the evidence for zero carb carnivore is like way more well sustained and epistemically valid than the evidence for like the Primal diet, the version that Diogenes does, or even the version that you know, people like me and Face IQ did for most of the time, which is like raw meat and milk, raw meat and raw milk, because basically, like, there's a lot of arguments against ingesting carbs after a certain age. The amount of damage that's caused by things that are not toxins in plants, not like the pulsatidine stuff, but in the carbs themselves and the insulin variations you get from them, it's pretty high. Likewise with fruit, you know, if you think about it, like think about it from the perspective of an engineer, right? You're a plant and you are trying to design a thing that will be eaten by some animal so that your seeds can spread. So as a plant, you're basically made of toxins, right? You're like a toxin pool of destruction and death. And you remove some of the toxins from yourself and maybe insert a little bit of sugar in there to attract some kind of animal. But it would be extremely expensive to remove the entirety of all the toxins that you're carrying within you. You should just continuously remove it until like some animal is like, that's the threshold that animal is either co-evolved to eat, or willing to eat because the sacrifice that's worth it for the animal from a calorie perspective or from a nutrition perspective. And that animal doesn't even necessarily have to be humans. In fact, most of the fruits that we have, they were adapted by humans eventually, but they co-evolved with other animals for millions and millions of years in order to become their original form before we modified them to be a little bit more sugary, a little bit less toxic. But they're still toxic. So yeah, so that's basically why for these last 2 years I haven't been eating any fruit, only milk, honey, and meat. And I'm quitting honey and meat because I need to lose weight, and that hasn't happened naturally. And also, very high frequency of cheating when I'm traveling, when an occasion asks for it, when I'm feeling impulsive, etc., etc. And every time, immediately if I'm doing zero carb and I cheat, I'm basically going to stop feeling amazing all the time. So it's really complicated. That's another very good argument for zero carb carnivore, possibly the best argument, which is you feel awesome all the time. Like the natural state of your body when it's both in ketosis and lacking every sort of toxin is unusually delicious and unusually delectable. And I don't particularly see why someone would sacrifice that for a little bit of fruit. I can kind of understand raw milk, but it's very addictive and it can be a little bit more damaging than it can be fruitful, depending on your age, right? If you still want to grow, but last but not least, there's like an ideology or an idea within the community that it definitely doesn't make sense evolutionarily, and I always kind of want to bring it out and point it out, which is the idea that bacteria are necessarily good for you. And that just comes from, regardless of any experiments, there have been experiments where, people inject themselves with diseases and then they get the diseases and, it's horrific, or they have to take an antidote or something like that. But even if you didn't believe those studies, which there's many of, there's an evolutionary logic which is very simple, right? Like organisms mutate and then they change, and they can change to being more on the parasitic side and more on the mutualistic side, more on the symbiotic side or more on the deleterious side, or even an inquilin, right, which is kind of a neutral participant in your ecosystem. And there is no magic. There's no magic potion from God or something that prevents microorganisms that are multiplying at a very high rate from becoming dangerous to people. So the idea that bacteria are scavengers is like, it's absolutely laughable to think that the entirety of the bacterial world can be summarized by like one sentence like that. Yes, there are some bacteria that are going to serve in a similar way to scavenging, and there are some bacteria that are going to self-regulate according to how your gut microbiome is operating. But that, like, there is absolutely no reason to expect it's not magic that an organism that evolved to become parasitical would be like unable to enter a human body, right? So you should definitely think that some bacteria are negative for the body. I know that there were two guys on TikTok who were experimenting with drinking water from like a dirty river, like a river that's known to be dirty and maybe toxic even. And, I predicted that they would eventually get sick. I don't know how long the experiment has been going because I was banned from TikTok, talking too much about raw meat and noticing too many things. But, you go ahead and tell me if you think I'm wrong about the bacteria. I do have a doctorate to back it, like I do know a little bit of biology. Anyway, bye. That was my first video in a long time, and hopefully the beginning of a new series and new style and vibes. Your favorite primal philosopher out.